When a high-explosive artillery shell slams into the earth, it doesn't care about the bravery or the morale of the men standing nearby. Survival on the Western Front in 1916 was a cold, brutal calculation. Look at this landscape. By the time the Australian Imperial Force arrived in the Somme sector, the pre-war world had been erased. Villages and forests were entirely replaced by churned earth and shattered timber. The transition of the AIF into France was a violent collision with industrial logistics. Their survival would be determined by hardware limitations and the physical constraints of the environment, not by sheer willpower. To understand these 1916 campaigns, we must discard the romanticized myths of combat and examine the battlefield with a forensic engineering perspective. Our primary blueprint for this autopsy is Volume 3 of the Official History of Australia in the War of 1914-1918, compiled by C.E.W. Bean. Bean documented exactly how this mechanical system operated. The efficiency of this battle space rested on three operational pillars: individual hardware, trench geometry, and macro-level command planning. The Western Front operated as a closed mechanical system. Every casualty was the direct result of friction between the neat, geometric plans drawn up on paper and the chaotic physical reality of the mud. This photograph shows the AIF infantry shortly after arrival. Even carrying their full combat packs, they are marching at a steady pace, equipped for a mobile campaign. That mobility vanished the moment it started raining. The soil in the Somme sector rapidly degrades into thick, viscous sludge, demanding a heavy industrial approach to warfare just to survive the elements. Observe the gear these frontline troops are carrying now. The role of the infantryman shifted from shooter to heavy laborer. Moving dirt and hauling wooden structural materials became their primary daily function. This diagram illustrates the mandatory 1916 combat loadout. A soldier carried a rifle and ammunition, but also entrenching tools, thick woolen winter coats, iron rations, and newly introduced chemical defense gear. The aggregate weight frequently exceeded 60 pounds. Moving through knee-deep mud carrying 60 pounds of dead weight severely restricted physical mobility. The maximum advancement speed of an attacking force dropped to a slow crawl. This loadout friction created a measurable reduction in combat effectiveness, caused entirely by the physical burden of the gear required to keep them alive. Because each man moved so slowly, commanders had to pack them together in massive numbers to ensure enough force reached the objective. This photograph reveals the result: a tightly packed sea of steel helmets, creating incredibly dense targets for enemy artillery. Before a single rifle was fired, the AIF's operational tempo was degraded. The sheer tonnage of hardware required simply to exist in this environment dictated exactly how fast they could fight. To accommodate these dense concentrations of troops, the ground itself had to be carved out according to strict engineering standards. This image details a 1916 frontline trench. Notice the deep earth walls and stacked sandbags, preventing collapse under artillery fire. Down the center are wooden duckboards and drainage channels. This engineering kept troops out of stagnant water, preventing trench foot, allowing logistics to flow. When two armies dig thousands of miles of these static, highly engineered earthworks, traditional maneuver warfare becomes impossible. The only way to create a breach is through mass industrial firepower. This photograph captures the mechanical scale required to shatter those deep trench networks. You can see the heavy howitzer barrel and the physical effort the artillery crew is expending just to load a single high-explosive shell. To protect the infantry during an assault, planners relied on the creeping barrage. This was a synchronized wall of artillery fire designed to advance across no man's land immediately ahead of the attacking troops, keeping the enemy suppressed in their dugouts. This diagram illustrates the precise geometry of the tactic. The red line of artillery impacts advances in strict 50-yard increments, operating on a rigid timetable. The blue line represents the infantry, following perilously close behind, trusting margins of error measured in seconds. But if heavy mud and loadout friction cause the infantry to walk slower than the programmed advancement rate of the guns, the creeping barrage walks away from them. A widening, unprotected gap opens up in the grid. Survival in a 1916 assault relied entirely on this brittle mathematical synchronization. If the timing failed, the barrage lifted too early, the enemy manned their machine guns, and the advancing troops were left completely exposed. At the macro-operational level, the physical realities of mud, weight, and friction were often abstracted into paper lines and topographic contours. This reliance on paper abstraction was a universal, systemic issue across all armies in 1916. Here, we see staff officers staring intensely at a flat map, isolated from the physical conditions of the battlefield. These officers calculated operational timelines using standard marching speeds derived from infantry walking on clean, flat ground, not wading through waist-deep sludge. This created a topographical delusion, a disconnect between the pristine contour lines on the headquarters map and the actual cratered ruin of the front line. Furthermore, the massive artillery bombardments actively destroyed the very terrain the maps were aced on. A perfectly charted approach route on paper was often, in reality, a flooded swamp of shell holes. Once an attack began, a complete communication blackout fell over the sector. Telephone wires were immediately severed by incoming fire, leaving commanders blind to the friction their troops were encountering. A lethal cascade effect took hold. Troops delayed by the mud missed their artillery timings. Without the suppression of the creeping barrage, the enemy could freely call in immediate, devastating counter-barrages on the exposed infantry. The staggering casualty lists recorded by Bean in Volume 3 were often the direct result of a systemic failure to translate the physical friction of the battle space onto operational maps. The topographic map, the programmed barrage, and the encumbered soldier were the moving parts of a single, rigid system. In 1916, these components were frequently out of alignment. The Western Front did not care about the AIF's previous reputation. It only responded to industrial weight and geometric precision. The lessons learned in the mud of 1916 necessitated a restructure of Australian tactical doctrine. Planners began shifting toward decentralized command, specialized assault loadouts, and flexible artillery coordination. These changes moved the AIF away from rigid top-down execution toward a more adaptive model of warfare. C.E.W. Bean's Volume 3 serves as a meticulous ledger documenting this systemic adaptation. To accurately understand the AIF's operations in 1916, we must look past simple narratives of heroics and analyze the cold, hard machinery of the battle space. The 1916 campaign completely transformed the AIF. By the end of the year, the force that arrived in France as a traditional infantry division became a component of a massive industrial machine.